Hi, welcome to Intro to Soc. Today we're going to be talking about family and education. Now, unfortunately, I wish I could talk about each of these topics in an individual lecture, but we are out of time in the class, so I do have to combine a little bit. So again, like all the other topics, it's going to be kind of brief, but I do encourage you to check out some of our other options that are available in family studies and sociology and American ethnic studies and the education department if you really want a broader lesson about these topics. I do encourage you to check that out. So this is the agenda for the day, what we're going to be talking about. So how do sociologists define family? What does that mean in the social sciences, particularly for sociologists? What do we perceive the role of the family being in society? How does the family influence individual development? Talk a little bit about how families are starting to change a little bit. How have they changed over time? How has the organization changed? How has the function changed? Then we're going to move on to education. So what does education do for us? What's its function? What purpose does it serve? We're going to talk about academic tracking. Some of you may have heard that term. That might be new for some of you, though. Talk a little bit about the incidence of school violence, what we know we can do, what are some things that aren't working, what are some trends. We're also going to look at the school to prison pipeline. That'll be kind of a culmination of looking at education and the criminal justice system, which is kind of interesting. We'll talk a little bit about zero tolerance policies, and you'll have a video to watch on that specifically, which I think you'll be really interested in. Lastly, we'll talk about credentialism. So what's the link between how we're educated and the job we get, our occupation? So first, what is family? We learned from the very beginning that family is the most basic of the social institutions. It's the very first institution that we as people come into contact with. It's our very first introduction into the world. It's the first primary socialization group. Family, gives people the first introduction into society's norms and values. So again, they teach us how to eat, they teach us how to talk, they teach us how to dress. They basically teach children how to belong in a society, how to not stick out like a sore thumb. We talked a lot about this in the socialization chapter that we did a few weeks ago, if you remember. Family is most commonly reunited through blood or genetics. It can be through marriage, and it can be through adoption. So there's lots of different ways that families can form. And it does come in many forms, as we'll see how it's kind of changing over time. So again, what does society do? It serves as the link between the individual and larger society. We aren't born knowing what to do. We aren't born knowing how to belong. Family ensures that society's norms and values are passed down and carried on. So we call this social reproduction. It's teaching new generations how to belong, how to reproduce society. If we didn't do that, we'd never have any idea what's going on at all. So family teaches you the socially acceptable norms, so the rules for behavior. We talked a little bit about dress, about dining etiquette, conversation rules. We learn language. We learn how to use body language. Family also teaches societal values, so those abstract ideals, not quite concrete rules. Things like work ethic. We learn about the laws. We know, like if you are approached by a police officer, they have a certain air of authority. We learn that from the family very early on. Practices and traditions. So in the US, we as kids tend to learn that the NFL and the Super Bowl are a big deal. Same with holidays. So we observe Christmas with our families, Thanksgiving, Valentine's Day. So overall, the family just ensures that society and its rules and traditions do go on and are reproduced and passed down to new generations. So what does the family do for individuals? Again, family teaches kids how to belong and how to be accepted into society. It teaches kids how to behave around other people, so how to respond to authority figures. So you learn from an early age that if you're left with a babysitter, the babysitter's in charge. Or when your family sends you off to school, they teach you that you need to listen to the teacher. So they're teaching you a little bit about the social positions in a society. Family also teaches kids what to expect in terms of treatment from other people based on their race, class, gender, and age. So hopefully you remember that talk that Clint Smith gave in our last lecture over race and ethnicity. Black boys are brought up with different concerns than white boys. They're taught how to behave differently to keep themselves safe. Also, not all families can provide comfort and support. So, sorry, accidentally went too far. Not all white families can provide comfort and support, so we do have issues of child abuse and neglect. Not all families can provide resources that are needed for the kids to succeed. Hopefully you can remember that from both social class. We'll talk a little bit about it in education, talk about it basically throughout everything, right? You've heard it in race, you've heard it in gender. So opportunities do vary depending on your social position. So for example, some kids aren't able to gain access to school supplies or healthy foods or extracurricular activities, cars, some of those things that can allow them to get a job, that can allow them to pursue a college scholarship. So that's important to remember that not all families have the same opportunities. So the family has changed over time. How has it changed? There's always been a lot of different types of families. Social scientists and society in general used to only recognize the nuclear family. You've probably heard that term before. Basically, all it means is that it's a leave it to beaver era with two parents, one or more kids. Yeah, the kind of 1950s era. But we know now that society is way too complex for this anymore. Today's sociologists recognize that families come in all shapes and sizes. So there are different types of families now that exist. They probably did exist, but maybe we just didn't acknowledge them as much as we do now, but we're starting to kind of expand our view of what the family looks like. So we know that there's step families, there's foster families, there's grandparent families, meaning grandparents who are raising their grandchildren. There's adoptive families, child-free families, so that means that couples are a family themselves. They choose not or cannot have biological children. Single-parent families. And not all families socialize their children according to society's norms and values, right? So technically that's supposed to be the job of the family, but we know that doesn't always happen. So there are some families whose behavior we might consider deviant, right? That might be criminal deviance or it might just be weird. So some families may pass down legacies of drug abuse or domestic violence, or perhaps the families involved in the furry community. So it can just really vary. So there is a concrete idea of what the family does, but that doesn't mean that all families do pass down those norms and values. Some of them do things a little bit differently. So unfortunately, not all families are supportive and comforting. I know some of you are planning to go into service fields, so this is really important. Even if a child is coming from a family, that doesn't mean that they are getting the emotional care that they need. Some families may teach kids that violence and aggression are acceptable forms of responses to stress or problems. Abuse and family violence can be more than just physical, so there are different kinds of abuse. This is important not only for parents and children. Family violence encompasses all sorts of different types, so we'll talk about that in just a second. But the different forms of violence that can occur are physical, so that means hitting, kicking, punching, shoving, pinching, emotional violence means name calling, or they're manipulating, they're gaslighting, they're shaming. There can be sexual violence, so of course that means inappropriate and unwanted sexual contact or harassment. Financial, so a family member may use another person's money that's unauthorized. They may scam them, they may fraud them. And there can be just general neglect where there's not necessarily violence going on, but there's failure to provide for basic needs, meaning maybe kids don't have clothing, they don't have food, they don't have shelter. So neglect is those failure to provide those basic needs, not necessarily meaning violence is always present, though it tends to kind of collaborate with some of the other types of violence. So like I said, there's different forms of family violence as we are coming to understand the family as being more complex. So family violence can occur between any family members, not just romantic partners. When we're talking about romantic partners specifically, we use the term intimate partner violence. That used to be called domestic violence, but we kind of changed the wording to recognize that violence can happen between partners who don't live together, right? So if you're just dating but you're not living together, that doesn't mean that you're not in an abusive relationship. So we have kind of changed that definition a bit. So there's also child abuse and neglect. We talked a little bit about that. So there's either some violence, sexual violence, emotional violence, or children are not getting their basic needs met. There's also elder abuse, meaning the abuse of elderly people that often comes in the form of financial abuse. So if a person is working with an elderly family member and the family member is trusting them to have access to their bank accounts and they are not reporting the numbers accurately, or they're withdrawing more for themselves, that's a kind of elder abuse. Of course, they can be abused physically, sexually, emotionally, but we do know that financial abuse is a really big problem for elders and caregivers. There's also forced marriage, so forcing a family member to marry a person without their consent. This does happen in the US. It's not just something that happens overseas. It does happen. So forcing people into marriages that they don't want is abusive, right? It's going against their will. It's putting them in a compromised situation in terms of whether or not they want to be intimate with that person. There's also honor killings. So you might have heard this term. It just means the killing of family members. Typically are going to be women whose behavior goes against religious or cultural customs. Perpetrators of this kind of violence argue that the killing is necessary to restore honor upon their family by showing that they will not tolerate the violation of these customs. So as you can see, this family violence takes a lot of different forms as we're starting to understand more about different cultural practices, as we're starting to embrace different types of families, different forms. So you can see how this has gone far beyond domestic violence, though domestic violence is still a problem. So let's move on to education. What is education? Again, what is education as a institution? So from a sociological perspective, education is a system of rules and norms that ensure the transmission of knowledge, values, and patterns of behavior from one generation to the next. So it's kind of similar to the definition we give family, only it's just another step, right? This is the first time that a lot of kids spend outside of their home. This is their very first entrance into the public. It is a secondary unit of socialization after family. So it's the very first time that kids are sent off to preschool. They're outside of their parents' home. They need to learn how to behave around other kids, around other adults, how to behave in public buildings. So what does education do? Education serves three primary functions in society. We talked about the teaching of academic knowledge and skills. It also serves a function in transmitting culture, meaning when you go to school, you learn how to dress, you learn a little bit about patriotism, so you're learning about your country, you learn to say the Pledge of Allegiance. You learn how to achieve. What does it mean to be goal-oriented? What are some goals that we value in society? You can learn something like sports. In general, it also helps with social integration. So it's preparing children to adapt to society and fit in as a functioning member, kind of in the same way that family is. So education also serves in the development of three different types of capital. Hopefully you can recall the word capital. We talked a little bit about it back in the social class section. So capital can help kids gain access to connections, to knowledge, and to skills and experience that they need to be independent and that they need to be successful and out on their own. So the first is social capital. We talked about this. Social capital is who you know. So when you are in college, like you are right now, that can be things like internships, recruitment, connections to people who are able to get you a job after you graduate. Cultural capital is what you know. So what you know means you know how to dress, you know what it means to be professional, you know proper etiquette, you know the language. Human capital means what you can do. This means your skill set. So reading, writing, if you've got really good computer and technology skills, that's been really commonly listed on job sites, that's becoming really a desired trait. If you have experience in a field, that also helps a lot. That builds upon your human capital. It makes you competitive on the job market, and companies do trainings to invest in the human capital of its employees, right? So a business is going to want all of its employees to be highly skilled, so they're putting in money for training. And education is building towards this. So not everything that kids learn through their social experiences are explicitly stated as being goals. Some knowledge, values, and norms are learned a little bit more subtly. So one thing we learn is about authority. So we learn who's in charge and who to respect. Sometimes we get told that directly, but sometimes we just kind of have to figure it out for ourselves, right? So when you first walked into the college classroom, you knew where you were supposed to sit and where a professor was supposed to stand. Nobody had to say that directly, you just kind of knew that intuitively. Next is professionalism. So we learn how to speak and behave professionally. We may not say exactly how that's supposed to be done directly, but if we get weird looks or if we get turned down for job offers, or if we are not getting the jobs that we want, we know that maybe we need to tweak that a little bit. We also learn about achievement and aspiration. So we learn to value the achievement of hard work. We learn about goal setting. Nobody necessarily has to tell us that, but we do kind of learn subtly that that's what we need to do to be successful in That's what we need to do to be successful in this society. So hopefully you can remember Max Weber. He wrote The Protestant Ethic. We talked a little bit about this back in theory and a little bit in culture. So we learn to adopt and accept the cultural values of hard work, efficiency, and frugality, particularly in American society. So we learn that these things ideally are supposed to lead to reward and boost in status and attainment. That's not always the case, though, as most of us know, as the job market's looking a little grim. So, talking about public school funding, how schools are funded is kind of a complex issue. It really kind of depends on the state and the type of school, meaning it's public, it's private, charter. But public school funding does come from three primary sources typically. So, one is the state. When it comes from the state, that means it's coming from income taxes, sales tax, and fees. When it's coming from a local level, that's the property taxes of homeowners in the neighborhood. Remember, we talked about that in race when we were talking about redlining and how that can be really problematic for minority children who aren't getting the proper schooling they need just because their homes weren't of high value. Next, it can come from the federal level, federal meaning grants for specific programs and services. So the government really grants relatively little money to the schools, and most funding is going to come from the state and local governments. There's also property taxes. So there's a school funding connection. The amount of property taxes collected depends on the property values of the homes in the neighborhood. So this means that the higher the property values, the higher the property taxes, meaning more funding for schools. And some low-income neighbors and kids are at a disadvantage, as you can imagine. So schools in low-income neighborhoods don't have high property taxes to rely on for funding. They have to rely on kind of the pennies of the state and federal assistance. It's really hard to get. It's really competitive. They really have to prove that they need a specific program or that their education is valuable enough, which is really frustrating. Schools that receive low funding tend to have low quality teachers and low quality teacher retention. They can't pay them enough to stay. They can have outdated books and technology materials. So at a poor school, they might not have any iPads. They might have really slow and dated computers. They may have just old damaged textbooks instead of getting new with updated information. And they may have less options for extracurricular activities as they don't have the funds to support these programs. So meaning uniforms, coaches, fields, travel equipment. Children from low-income neighborhoods begin at a disadvantage through no fault of their own. They have less opportunity to gain any of the forms of capital that are necessary to enter the workforce. We talked about this in social class. If you don't know what you need to do to be successful, if you don't have the connections that you need, if you aren't getting skills, it's going to be really hard to get to where you want to go in life. It's going to really narrow those opportunities, which is going to affect the choices that you have. And of course, being poor should not be a barrier to receiving a quality education. So this is something that as a country and a society, we really need to work towards achieving more equality in terms of school funding. So next, let's talk a little bit about academic tracking. Some of you may have heard this term, this might be new. So tracking is a process through which students are assigned to different classes, experiences, and opportunities based on their level of achievement. So there are children who are considered to be gifted, average, or below average. Children who are labeled as gifted are more likely to be put on academic tracks and to gain more experience in the fields that are really important on the job market, really highly valued, like mathematics, foreign language, literature. And tracking happens very early on in a student's career, so this tends to happen around 7th or 8th grade, and this does pose a problem for students who are coming from low-income elementary schools, so they weren't afforded the means to gain any of those three types of capital we just talked about. They aren't given a chance to catch up to their peers who are coming from wealthier school districts with quality teachers, updated technology and books, and updated and advanced curriculum. Students who come from middle to high income families and neighborhoods may have had the privilege to be involved in activities like tutoring. So if they're struggling, they've got somebody they can rely on to help them through the class without failing. They may have the opportunity to go to camps, so they're building relationships, they're building skills, they're earning badges. They may have the opportunity to engage in music lessons or sports. So this is going to give them an opportunity to get really, really good at violin or get really, really good at football so that they can maybe get a scholarship from a college that gives them kind of a leg up. And they may also have parents who are highly educated or the guardians who might know the ropes. So they have good social connections. Their parents are aware of how they need to access funds. They know the importance of scholarships. They know the importance of skill building. Their parents might have knowledge of how to succeed and proceed through the educational system in pursuit of job skills. Parents may also be able to help their children with scholarship opportunities. So parents may themselves may have really high social, cultural, and human capital. So they may have more cultural knowledge of how to get a scholarship. So it's not just about ability or intelligence. It's about access to opportunities to make connections and to gain skills and knowledge before you are tracked, before somebody decides that, oh, you are really, really smart, so therefore we're going to set you up to learn more about STEM fields. Oh, you're really struggling. Maybe you belong in an industry when industry is totally fine. But what if you don't want to do that? Maybe you want to be a mathematician, but you just haven't been given those opportunities to get those skills. Or maybe somebody who is forced into a STEM field doesn't want to be in a STEM field. Maybe they really want to be a plumber or work in some sort of lucrative industry. That's all great, but we're not really embracing that, and that can be really it can be a really big problem and set people up on the wrong track. So this all harkens back to social conditions, right? We may all be fully capable, but some of us may have more opportunities than others. And we as a society need to work on extending opportunities to everyone very early on, even as kids. So let's talk just a little bit about school violence. Unfortunately, this is a big problem, but school violence does extend far beyond just school shootings. School violence is any form of violence that occurs on school property or during a school-sponsored event. School violence may involve staff, students, teachers, administrators, anybody who's involved in that school. There's lots of different types of school violence. So there's bullying, there's general fighting, there's gang violence that occurs on school property. There's sexual violence that occurs on school property, or something even as vicious as murder can happen on school property. That's not necessarily like a school shooting per se. So given the publicity of school shootings in particular, schools have taken drastic measures to prevent school violence. So this means that increased surveillance is happening. That means there's a lot more check-ins, there's metal detectors, there's a police presence, there's lockdown drills. They are influencing anti-bullying education. They are engaging in early offender intervention. So they're trying to determine which kids are quote unquote at risk early on. There's clear-cut violence policies and punishments, which means zero tolerance. So if a person decides that they are done being bullied and one day they hit the bully back in the face, that's zero tolerance. Both them and the bully are in trouble. And then there's conflict mediation and resolution as well. So there's just a big expansion of punishment and discipline that's going on in schools, trying to curb this school violence, but at the same time, we're not quite getting at the root of why this violence is happening. So the prison to school pipeline, or the school to prison pipeline. Schools seek to demonstrate that they're being firm and proactive in addressing concerns about school violence. Of course, they seek to prevent violence before it happens. They don't want a school shooting to happen at their school, of course. So they've begun to involve the police and the criminal justice system in school punishments and policies, often for very minor and nonviolent infractions. For example, dress code infractions. You'll see a video on this in your worksheet that you'll find really interesting. And it's argued to work as a way to kind of scare kids away from potentially more serious actions. So it's trying to deter them from going any further. So zero tolerance policies require that school officials give students a consistent and often harsh punishment for a given action without regard for the situational circumstances. Like, was it a person who's been bullied for a long time and they are trying to defend themselves? The reason for student behavior, the student disciplinary actions. So is this a first-time offender? Is this a sixth-time offender? That doesn't matter. So everybody who offends gets the same response, that gets the same discipline. So while the need to protect the well-being of students is undeniable, critics of these policies argue that these policies may be having a reverse effect in protecting students. Students are becoming fearful and suspicious of one another, and school administrators, teachers, and staff. So everybody's just kind of walking on eggshells, waiting for something to happen. Students don't want to take a misstep. Teachers are nervous that their students are going to lash out. So it's just a very uncomfortable environment. Students also begin to distrust and fear the police. So when the police are present, they feel like they're going to be disciplined for something minor instead of seeing the police as somebody who's there to help them. Students get caught up in the criminal justice system and they begin to accept their delinquent label. Remember, we talked a little bit about stigma. We talked about labeling theory back in Crime and Deviance. And low-income students in particular are at a greater risk for this as they haven't been afforded the opportunities to learn norms. We just talked about this in the last slide. So they may steal school supplies because they haven't been taught how to ask for help from adults or are untrusting of them. Maybe they don't ask because they want to protect their parents from the school, knowing that they can't provide for their kids. They don't want to expose their own neglect. And they're fearful of system intervention instead of asking for help, so they feel like they have to resort to stealing to kind of keep that secret and to keep their family intact. Black male students are also at high risk due to the stereotypes that people have about them as being violent. We talked about this in Clint Smith's talk. So people assume that they are up to no good without any indication that this assumption is true. So we need to be proactive in school safety, yes, but we also need to learn through trial and error about what works and what doesn't. So we need to consider the different needs that kids from different social conditions have and to try to work with them to catch up, to try to give them equal opportunity to succeed. We need to encourage them to seek help safely without stigmatizing or labeling them. School should be a safe place for all students. So let's talk a little bit about credentialism. This term was actually new to me not too long ago, so it might be new to you too. So credentialism is a common practice of relying on earned credentials as a shortcut to determining a person's expected abilities and competencies for a certain job. So that means if you've got a degree, a license, or a certificate, people are going to kind of assume that you know what you're doing, whether you do or not. Because this can be a problem. It reinforces the incorrect idea that college education is the only path to success, or that if people don't go to college, they're less capable or smart. This is completely untrue. There's lots of different paths to success. We need people working in industry. We need people working in academics. So education is just one path. School isn't for everyone, and we all have many unique and needed strengths to contribute to society. This also means that very skilled and smart and really capable people are turned down for jobs because of assumptions that are made about their capabilities and intelligence based on their lack of credentials. So we need to give everyone a chance to learn and to succeed. So maybe somebody doesn't have a license in something, but that doesn't mean that they can't be trained to do a good job. So academic achievement isn't the gold standard. We can all achieve success in many different ways. So while school is really important, schools can do better to validate non-academic career paths and to encourage students to choose the path that best suits their interests and strengths. College is one really great option, but it shouldn't be forced or viewed as superior to any career path, as everybody has something to contribute to a functioning society. So that is all I have for today. Again, that was like a really brief overview of both of these systems. If you are interested in learning more about it, please seek out some opportunities in the education department, seek them out in sociology, especially if you're looking to be a teacher or you're looking to work with families. It's really important that you start to get a really clear grasp on these problems that are occurring in these systems. I think that you're really going to enjoy the worksheet this week. I've got some really interesting documentaries for you to work on. So have a great week. Thanks for watching.